Okay, so welcome everybody. As you know, there's a very large literature on kinship and Aboriginal marriage systems. The kinship systems are changing relatively slowly, but they're changing. But marriage arrangements have changed rapidly. And the old marriage arrangements, which were very important to people up until the 80s or 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, have gone. There's no polygamy anymore, and the age difference at marriage, which was so influential in how the kinship system worked, has gone, because in the 70s, even in the 70s, young girls who got married, their husband was up to 20 years older than them. And now, of course, the situation in almost all, if not all, Aboriginal communities is that people's husbands are the same age as themselves in the younger generation. So we'll see what a big influence that has on how one understands how the kinship systems work. What I'm going to do is quickly run through basic elements of kinship and then go on to look at taking genealogies. So the first thing is the classificatory kinship system. How do people end up having many people called mother, father, uncle, and the rest of it? And the basic reason for this is the equivalence of siblings of the same sex, right? So that if you call a woman mother, then you call her sister mother. If you call a man father, you call his brother father too, which of course is different from our own system, where we would call those people aunt and uncle. And then the other feature is the universal system of kin classification. That is, everybody in the social universe is classified as kin. And we'll see that that really brings with it a number of things, but one of the things it brings with it is the politics of kin terms, and I'll run through a little example in a minute of that. And then the third thing, which is not so important, is that relatives by marriage are brought into the class of blood relatives. That is, the wife of anybody you call father is mother. Well, that's fairly straightforward, and it's not a crucial element. Okay, so this is just demonstrating what I've said about the equivalence of siblings of the same sex. So in this diagram, which I'm sure you're all familiar with from the point of view of ego, if you call this person father, then you call his brother father. And because you call him father, you call his children brother and sister. And likewise, if you go back generation, you call the him father's father, you use the same term for his brother. And what do fathers have? They give birth to fathers. And what kind of children do fathers have? They have brothers and sisters. And so you can see how the kin terms proliferate, and you eventually can apply a kin term to everybody in your social universe. It's how the more remote people get included is a bit more complicated, but that's the basic way in which you end up classifying as kin. And this is an example of how this then relates to a politics around the application of kin terms. Because you can trace your relationship to any particular person through both the mother and the father. Now, if everybody marries correctly, then tracing a relationship to somebody through the mother and the father should end up you applying the same term to them. But of course, there's no system where everybody ends up marrying correctly for all sorts of reasons. And here's an example, which is actually from an English example, and from the early 20th century, where a man uh, married a woman and very quickly realized that he really actually wanted to be married to her sister. You couldn't, at that time in 1900, you couldn't marry your wife's sister. He was able to lobby to get the law changed, and shortly afterwards he switched from, divorced the first sister and married the second sister. The second sister herself had been married, but she divorced, but not before she'd had a child. So the question is, what does Ego call this girl here? If Ego traces the links to the girl through the mother, this is Ego's mother. In English, this is Ego's aunt. So she would be a cousin. But if Ego traces the links to this girl through his father, then when he then gets married to this person and is presumably looking after this girl along with her mother, then he would call her daughter. I'm sorry, sister. Fathers have daughters. So if he traced the link to this girl through his father, she would be a sister. And of course, that makes a huge difference. Cousins are marriageable, sisters are not. Now, what would determine which kind of kinship term would be applied to this person would depend presumably very much on what age these divorces and remarriages took place. And if they were both, say, 2 years old when the remarriage took place and they grew up together, then presumably he would call her sister. But if they were 15, 20 when this all happened, then he'd go on calling her cousin. And so one can see these issues about co-residence and time, whether you trace links through the father or the mother, play an important role in the politics of kinship. And you see that all the time in remote communities. Okay, another way in which people are classified is by descent. And it's really important to make this distinction between classification of people and actual groups on the ground. So actual groups on the ground would be a family, a household, a camp, a band, a group of people that you can actually see on the ground. Clans or unilineal descent groups are not groups in a sort of social sense. They're a classification of people. They do things together, but they rarely ever meet a clan, everybody in a clan together, or if they do, it's only very occasionally. They're classifications of people, principally, not social groups that you find on the ground. Okay, so there are two kinds of descent groups, unilineal descent groups in Australia, patrilineal and matrilineal, right? So here's a very sparse male one, here's a very sparse female one. And then there's the third kind, cognatic descent, which is where you trace descent through any sequence of male and female. There's no privileged sequences of either female or male. Throughout Australia, except for in the desert, the patrilineal descent is the key way in which people get the most important interest in land. And of course, it's even now happening in the remote areas of the desert, because many people can't get, even today, to their country in remote areas. So how do they relate to their country? They say, that was my father's country. And sometimes they say it's their mother's country too, but in terms of primary claims, even in the remote areas of desert, it's all moving to a patrilineal model as well. So patrilineal descent groups are found throughout the continent. Matrilineal descent groups are quite common. They're found throughout Eastern Australia. They're found in Northern South Australia. They're found in parts of Arnhem Land. They're mainly to do with marriage arrangements, right? Some people want to claim that that matrilineal descent groups own land in Northern South Australia. I think it's a furphy. I don't think the evidence is at all good for that. Many Aboriginal people in Eastern Australia tend to think that matrilineal descent groups had rights in land because so many of their connections to each other today are matrilineal or through women because of the disruption of the marriage system and because people have married non-Aboriginal people. But classically, there's no evidence of land being passed down through women as the primary interest. You get rights through your mother, but you don't get your primary interest through your mother. Now, in Australia, unilineal descent groups are exogamous. That is, you marry outside your own group, both matrilineal and patrilineal. You marry somebody from a different patrilineal group and a different matrilineal group. There are areas in the world where you marry people of the same patrilineal group as yourself, particularly the Middle East. So we come to what's really confusing, and this is the terminology. And there's no kind of completely agreed on terminology. But basically, when somebody says patriline or patrilineage or patriclan, in most situations, they're just using these terms interchangeably, although there are differences between lineage and clan. Technically, a lineage is where all the people know their relationship to each other. Whereas in a clan, people believe they're related to know they're related to each other, but they don't know the actual links. So to take an extreme example of a clan, many of us like to think we have a connection to Scottish clans, a MacDonald, a McLaren, a Macintosh, what have you. And of course, this is at the most extreme end. There are people all over the world who claim to be MacDonalds, and of course they know anything about each other at all. That's an extreme form of clanship. Normally in anthropological writings, clans are quite big. If you go to Papua New Guinea, a clan, many clans are 500 or 600 people. And that's one of the reasons why some people don't feel very comfortable using clan, because it's sort of normally thought of as very big, whereas in Australia, classically, and even today, clans tend to be relatively small, for around 50 people. There are other more theoretical issues, which I won't go into right now, but they focus on the issue of, do Aboriginal people have descent ideologies, or is their kinship system one of patrifiliation? Now, if anybody wants me to talk about that, I can do, but it gets a bit technical. But I can explain the difference between patrifiliation and patrilineal later on if people are interested. So just to emphasize, descent's about classification. The other thing to say about descent, as you would, I'm sure most of you have experienced, descent is about cutting people out, really. It's not about including people. It's about saying you're not a member, it's just us, few people. And you can see this quite clearly where there's no money associated with what's going on in an area, in interactions with land councils and the rest of it, particularly say in the Northern Territory, where the government has started paying rent for buildings in settlements. Prior to it paying rents, nobody much cared about who the TOs were, and they had relatively little influence, right? As soon, because there was nothing to allocate, but as soon as the government started paying rents, of course, then suddenly the dissent groups emerged, and they were sort of very narrowly defined as people wanted to keep control of the money. And that's going on everywhere. I'm sure you've all experienced that. Okay, another kind of classification of people is moieties, from the French for half. There are 4 kinds of moieties in Australia. Not every linguistic group has all 4. Some only have 2. I'm not sure if any group has all 4. If you're not familiar with them, the most easy to understand, but the rarest, are sex moieties. So there are sex moieties in Victoria, and that is one moiety is of women, and the other moiety is men. And these are really only important in ceremony. So when they want to initiate a ceremony related to marriage arrangements, the men go out and they look for the totem that stands for women, which is a small bird, and they kill it. And they bring it back and they show it to the women to provoke them. And then the women go out into the bush and they kill the bird, which is the totem symbolism for the male moiety, and that sets off the ceremony, right? So in parentheses, I guess you're all clear about totemism. Basically, totems are symbols of relationships. So a clan totem symbolizes the relationship between people in a clan. It symbolizes the relationship between the people in the clan and their ancestors. A sex moiety totemism just symbolizes the solidarity of the female group or the male group. Another kind of moiety which we're more sort of familiar with ourselves, which we don't actually have explicitly, but is very much in evidence in our own kinship system, are generational moieties. You see this in the terminology for grandparents and grandchildren. So we're linking grandparents with grandchildren as they do in generational moieties, and what the differential is age, parent for old and child for young. And in many countries around the world, grandparents and grandchildren are linked in moieties, basically because the grandparents are dropping out of society, the grandchildren are replacing them, and there's that very indulgent relationship between the people who are losing power in society and the ones who are coming up and who will take over in the present. And such moieties are named in many areas of Aboriginal Australia, right? And then there are patrilineal and matrilineal moieties, which are much more common. And I think the easiest way to think about a patrilineal moiety is if you imagine a society which had just 2 clans in it. I tend to use clans out of that language just because it's simple and universal. So if we imagine a society of just 2 clans, and there would be no such society, but if we imagine that, one clan, all of the people of your own generation would be, in your own clan, would be brothers and sisters. And given that clans are exogamous, the other clans would be, all the people of your own generation would be potential husbands and wives. So you'd have a moiety system. You'd have your own system where it's all brothers and sisters. you have the other system where it's all potential husbands and wives. And so in any group of people, there are many clans, and many of those clans you call people in your own generation brother and sister, so they're in your own moiety. And you, in the other, many of the other clans, you call the people in your own generation potential husband or potential wife, depending on whether you're male or female. And so you get that division into two groups. And those moieties are generally important in respect to ceremony and ritual. And in some areas, they divide up also much of the natural environment, animals and plants, but not all of the animals and plants. Now, if we go to Arnhem Land, these moieties are named, the patrilineal moieties, they're named Dua and Yiddicha. So this is a sociocentric naming. Everybody agrees that X is Dua, and Mr. X belongs to the Dua moiety, and Miss Y belongs to the Yiddicha moiety. That's, everybody makes the same classification and uses the same terms. A little bit more tricky are patrilineal moieties amongst the Walbury, because the groups of the people classified together are the same people, so they're sociocentric, but the terms used for them are from the point of view of the speaker. So if I want to talk about my patrilineal moiety, I say my moiety, my Kira moiety does this or has this totem. And the other moiety, the Kutungulu moiety, has another totem. And when this Kutungulu person's talking about his moiety, he says, my Kira moiety does this, and the opposite moiety, the Kutungulu moiety, does it differently. So the composition of people in the moieties doesn't change, but the term you use for them is relative to who's speaking, a little bit confusing. Matrilineal moieties work exactly the same way. You've got, I suppose the easiest way to think about it is to say, you've got all those other clans in which the people in your, women in your parents' generation you call mother. And then you've got all the other matrilineal clans where the people in your mother's generation you call mother-in-law or potential mother-in-law. So you're differentiating them and into two groups. Okay, so those are, that's pretty important. Okay, so here is something that's very important, and I guess many of you probably know this. This is the importance of cross cousins. Throughout much of the world, approved and person for marriage for an ego, male or female, is their cross cousins. That is their mother's brother's children or their father's sister's children. That's where the cross comes in. You're crossing the gender link in the linking parent. So this is the cross cousin. Where you trace the link to what people we would call cousins through somebody of the same sex, they're parallel cousins, and you end up calling them brothers and sisters. Now, of course, genetically, all these people are equally close or distant. But the reason why they're different is no matter whether it's a matrilineal system or a patrilineal system, these people we will call cousins will always be in a different descent group from yourself. So that makes them marriageable. And these ones will always be in a category that are unmarriageable, and that's why they're called brothers and sisters. And we know many Aboriginal people maintain this distinction. In English, they talk about a cousin brother, cousin sister, and they're talking about parallel cousins, right? In English, that's what they're trying to maintain, or not trying to, they are maintaining this distinction. So this is utterly crucial. So if you ask sort of, why is it so common that people marry their cross cousins? Then I think you have to kind of think back to a situation in which, particularly where there's polygyny, I mean, people have many wives, and there's competition for wives, people like to get into contractual relationships as early as possible, so that they get promised wives. Somebody's promised me a wife. They're not waiting until everybody grows up till the right age. They're trying to get a contract going earlier than that, so that they don't miss out, because there's quite difficult to get a wife, or to get a wife when you're young. So obviously, who can you trust? The people you can trust are these very close relatives, right? Like your mother's brother and your father's sister. And so it's not very surprising that many people seek to make arrangements with their mother's brother's daughters, mother's brother's sons, father's sister's daughters, father's sister's sons. And of course, in Australia, these contracts, which are obviously are pushed back further and further, because they can be pushed back to booking up a wife before she's born. The way that this is, these contracts are kind of made real is by being written on the body, because the person in much of Australia, not all, but say all of desert Australia, who circumcises you is obliged to find you a daughter, or to find somebody, if they don't have any daughters, to find you a wife. So that contract, the promise contract, is physically written on the body. In other areas where population's denser and people see each other more and the rest of it, generally it's not written. The circumciser may not be the father-in-law, but in the desert areas where people are moving around a lot and often wouldn't see each other from year to year, it's very important. It's one of the functions of ritual. You've got lots of people witnessing the initiation rites. Everybody knows who did it. In desert cultures, you can't speak to the circumciser. You can never, for a few years, you can't mention his personal name ever. So these contracts are written into the body and behaviorally. So cross cousins are very important. And of course, these are first cross cousins. And we all know that the other very common person to marry is a second cross cousin. I'll come back to that a bit later on. I just put this in for fun, because I don't know a lot about Cape York kinship system, which are broadly similar to the rest of the continent, but there is a great deal of variation in the Cape, right? And why I put this in is because popular opinion, indeed some academics have written about this, have claimed that, worldwide it's very common for the terms for mother to be something like mama or mum and sounding words, right? And that's said to come from sucking at the breast. They're sucking and they pull back and sound. And that's why the common words for mother across the globe are like mum, mummy, ma. And Similarly, worldwide, it's very common to find words, like words and cognates for father. However, this is what's so wonderful about Australian cultures. They always prove exceptions to these kinds of generalizations. And in Central Australia, amongst the Pitjantjatjara, mama is for father. And up here in Cape York, we can see papa is used for mother. So great, you know. The human imagination's wonderful, and it's not easily contained. And people's thinking and the reasons they think in ways are much more complicated than these kind of simplistic ideas that it's simply the common term for mother comes from suckling. And of course, the reason people may have adopted papa for mother here may be in opposition to other people who use mama. You know, who knows why they did. I just think it keeps us on our toes. The other thing that's typical about Cape York, and I don't think from talking to Dave Martin that it's probably anything like as important as it used to be, is it was very important, the age difference between elder brother and younger brother, between elder sister and younger sister. And it was only in elder brother, younger brother, the distinction between elder mother brother and younger mother's brother, you could only marry the children of the younger mother's brother, not of the elder mother's brother. So that was important in terms of marriage relationships, but those things have largely gone now because parents can't determine who their daughters marry. People are making their own choices. That's really why the promise system has fallen apart everywhere. I'm going to move on to genealogy now. Is there anybody got any questions about any of this, any of kinship things? No. Okay. I guess you've all heard of the genealogical method. I kind of think that it's a mystification talking about the genealogical method, because the genealogical method is nothing to do with taking genealogies, of course. The genealogical method was described by William Rivers, who was a medical doctor and went on the Cambridge expedition to the Torres Strait in 1898. And he was interested, as a psychologist as well, and he was interested in color terms and also in people's ability to see color. Were there people who were colorblind amongst the Torres Strait Islanders? And he found that taking a good family tree was very helpful. Of course, he wasn't an anthropologist. He came at this as a complete outsider, a person who traveled a lot. It was one of the reasons why he joined the expedition, because he liked traveling around. But he realized that he could learn a lot from getting a good family tree. Okay, so there are different kinds of family trees. If you want it as a chart of ancestors, you have ego at the base, and you're looking up to the apical ancestors. Right? If you want it as a chart of descendants, you have a point at the top, and then you look down to all the people who are descended from them. And if you don't want to do it in an ancestral way or a descendant way, you can just do it as a kindred. That is somebody roughly in the middle of a circle of living relatives who they interact with, which we would call a kindred. Now, Rivers actually got converted to anthropology by going to the Torres Strait. He was thrilled with it, and he almost immediately after went to southern India and did field work there and wrote a classic work on the todas in the Nilgiri Hills, who are well known apart from anything else for polyandry, women having several husbands at the same time, right? Now, what's the genealogical method? And the genealogical method is, if you've got a good genealogy, you can do a lot with it. It isn't about how you get a good genealogy, it's what you can do with a good genealogy. And he set out what you could do with a good genealogy in his article in 1910 in the Sociological Review. So, and of course, in a sense, he was just exploring sort of what's anthropological commonplace now. Particularly if you're working with people where it's a universal system of kin classification, you're classifying everybody as a kinsperson, you can use this in lots of ways to find out about their social life. So if you've got a good family tree, then you can use it to work out what terms they use for different relatives. You can work out marriage arrangements. You can work out descent rules. You can work out what do people do by migration. He means here residence at marriage. Obviously, this is a very important issue. Where are people going to live at marriage? In most marrying systems, somebody has to move, not in all, but in most. Okay, kinship is obviously important in who collaborates with whom in ritual and ceremonies. It's very important in a good genealogy if you want to do a demographic study on fertility rates, survival rates, etc. Physical anthropology, tracing people with genetic diseases, like as on Groot Island, where they have this very debilitating Machado-Joseph disease. It's absolutely crucial knowing who's got it, because they pass it on to their children. Other things he mentioned, the transmission of names. You can see if people, as in they do in most cultures, often take names for children, grandchildren, grandparents give names to grandchildren, and you can find other kinds of things. And it also got the benefits of concreteness. As any of you will know, talking to somebody about their kin and their connection to other people is utterly impossible. You know, if they just say, oh, well, it's my brother's uncle's sister, who's my very good friend, and her husband is so-and-so's brother, you know, and you're lost immediately, right? But if you've got a genealogy and then you can trace it out, then of course you can make sense of that. And one of the things I could come to later, taking a genealogy, using even matchsticks or something like that can be quite helpful to make sure that you kind of know who you're talking about, and you don't get lost in all this sort of verbal talking about genealogies. Now, this is me, I've added these in. Other uses for a good genealogy, it's a good place to start when you're in a place for a short time and have no language but want to get to know something about people and connections. One of the incidental effects of collecting genealogies from a number of people in a village is that it gives you a chance to check. People don't like being checked on, of course, and so you don't want to say, I'm just checking on what somebody told me, but of course, because their genealogies overlap, you get to see either the accuracy of an informant or the politics of play, because people will give you different genealogies, as we know, dropping some people out, including other people. It puts you on exactly the same footing as the, or even in a pupil role, as the anthropologists are basically pupils in everything they do with people. So it sets that relationship up in a good way. And of course, genealogies are very important to people, otherwise they wouldn't provide them and wouldn't spend time providing them to you, because they know what their importance is in many cultures, right? Yes, I'm not quite sure what I had in mind about that phrase there. I'm sure I could put some content into it, but I've forgotten exactly what it's mine. And it's also, I mean, when I say puts anthropologists on a par with science, that it's very strongly evidential. I mean, one of the things about anthropology today is the demands for evidence are much stronger now than an evidential base for what you say is important, and that's become particularly important with appearing in court. Okay, this is just River's genealogy, not much different from anybody else's. So taking an extended genealogy, I guess very few of you will take an extended genealogy, right? Taking an extended genealogy is very time consuming. I don't think you could do it with anybody, even a sort of a minimally good extended genealogy under 2 or 3 hours minimum. But the crucial thing, whether you're taking extended genealogy, a comprehensive one that is, or even a much more instrumental one, as most of us are doing in native title at the time, you must know why you're taking it, right? Obviously, one reason you're taking it is the connections between people, but you also need to decide what other additional information do you want to collect when you talk about each person on the genealogy. Now, you can't afford to collect much information about each person, otherwise the whole process gets very, very strung out, right? So obviously you would need to know their name, right? And and their gender. Those two things will come sort of with drawing out the genealogy. But you may want to know where they were conceived, or where their residence is, or if they're dead, where they're buried, or you may have 1 or 2 other pieces of information that you know to be crucial in your system that you're working with and the people you're trying to trace. You must decide what they are. Just 1 or 2 pieces of extra information. You can't get more than that. You can't be collecting a genealogy for a native title claim and be trying to get really good, accurate information for a demographic study on completed fertility amongst women, because people often leave out stillbirths or children that died early, and you have to, if you want to get those, you've got to train your informant about what you need right at the very beginning, and let them know, so they know to tell you, and to, if you're working with an assistant, know to help other people tell you about those things. Decide how to record it. You can't really record it on your computer. You've got to do it on paper, pen and paper, and then you can make decisions about how you're going to graphically represent it. Now, if you're taking any genealogy, you've really got to train. It sounds like that's a rather strong word, but you've got to be utterly consistent in what you do if you want to get good information. And the classic way of, if you're taking extended genealogy, of training somebody is to start with them and their husband and their first husband and their own children, right? Because they know the information, they're totally on top of it. It's their family, they know everything about birth order, they know about stillbirths and miscarriages, if that's what you're looking for. They know about everything. So by being utterly consistent and systematic, going through the order of people with the people whom they know everything about, when you get higher up into the levels, upper levels of the genealogy, where people's memory is partial and patchy, nevertheless, they'll know what information you are seeking, and with luck will help get that information where it's available. And I should say, as you probably all know, that Aboriginal genealogical memory is not particularly deep. It's culturally shallow. If you've got a 60-year-old, you'd be lucky to get much beyond 80 or 90 years in their memory. You can't go back much beyond 2 generations accurately with most old people. That contrasts with some societies where they have people whose job it is to remember genealogy, such as in Hawaii and places like that. Basil Sanson's got a very good article in the references at the end on the shallowness of Aboriginal genealogical memory, which is a cultural factor, right? So if you're doing an extended genealogy, which most of you not, you've got willing informants who are prepared to spend the time with you, you start with the lower levels. I think it's also probably quite good. You need to make another decision. Are you going to work with one person or a brains trust, right? And really, it's better to work with one person, because then you start to understand some of the landscape of memory, the distribution, the fact that on the whole, it's better to work with women, older women, than it is with older men. They're much more reliable about people. They've much better handle on people's names and generally, most people find they're much better to work with, right? If you get a sort of brains trust of people, this may be important in situations where things are highly contested and you're trying to get some public consensus. Whether that public consensus will hang together is another matter. You might do it with a brains trust. So you need to think about where you're going to do this. And you need to be mindful that sort of asking questions and doing everything by interview and questions is very much our way of transmitting information. It's not how information is transmitted in most Aboriginal situations. People husband information in Aboriginal situations. And so they're often, many people are reluctant to impart some kinds of information. And that's where working with an assistant who understands what you're interested in and the rest of it is important. Okay, you'll all know this. You need a lot of paper because people quite often have large numbers of siblings. They make corrections. They remember people they've left out. They forget people's names. You can't spell their names. I can't tell you how many times I've found I've spelt people's names wrong, because of course, Aboriginal people are very creative with, certainly with European names. They get the birth order wrong, and you want the birth order. They often forget some kind of spouse who they were married to and died, or they didn't have any children with. And as I said, you can't spell their names. And by the way, look, I realized when I sent out the first PowerPoint, it had 3 genealogies I'd collected, and I was so used to being totally in control of a PowerPoint that I do often use examples because people can't take them away. But if you could just trash that first PowerPoint, because I shouldn't really be distributing those fractions of other people's genealogies. And here's this one I've got from Chagnon's The Yanomamo, which any of you who've done anthropology will know about. And it's not particularly messy, actually. I mean, this is a very unmessy genealogy. And you can see that he's not collected anything other than people's names. Whereas, and there may be good reasons for that. He was interested in genetic things, so he was obviously very keen on getting making sure that he's talking about biological relationships and the rest of it, and birth order and that sort of thing. But there's no other kind of information here being collected, which is a bit unusual. I put this in because this is one suggested way in the sequence on which you collect terms, a genealogy. So if you're starting with ego and male or female, that's what this shape means here. They say first you ask the person, who's your father, right? And then you say, all right, who was your father's mother? Who was your mother, right? And who was your father's father? So you get these people. And then you say, what other children did these people have, right? Are you the oldest? No, oh, I had a sister, from these 2. And then you get the sister, right? And then you finish the sister. You find out, was she married? Yes, she had a husband. She had 1 child, and that 1 child, you finish off everything about did they ever get married? They might have had several husbands or wives, and you said, did they have any children? So you finish them right out. Then you come back, right? And so here's the sequence. Then you ask, they suggest you ask about the mother, and who was the mother's mother, and who was the mother's father? What other children they have besides you, right? That's what I mean about training the person to be utterly systematic. So you don't have to observe this order, but you need to be utterly systematic in what you're doing. And given that once we're trying to emphasize sort of biological relationships in genealogy, you need to be utterly clear that people are talking about their biological mother and biological father, or if in some cases there's adoption. And this diagram comes from Barnard and Good's reference, which is in the references at the end. Okay, so sorry, I've made most of these points. You must be clear on what you want to know. Obviously, if you're looking for apicals and you're not really interested in children, young children, or anybody who's under 40 or 50, you're going to be working in a different way from if you're looking for collaterals, how wide does the group go? Or you're simply trying to compile a comprehensive list of everybody in a cognatic descent group. Think of this other kind of information that you want, but not too much of it, older women, and often if you can work in a separate quiet location, it's good. As I said, it's 2 or 3 hours minimum. You need to have tea and biscuits if you're going to do an extended genealogy in particular. And I like this. Jokes from the New Yorker are not funny, but this one rings a bell. And there are a lot of people out there who like talking to anthropologists. I like to think of this as Ron and Catherine Byrne, right? They worked in New Guinea as well as Australia. And I certainly, this is true in my experience. There are lots of people who really enjoy, older people, who really enjoy working with anthropologists. Okay, now look, this is something that sort of is important to you. There are big problems with claimed genealogies if you think they're very helpful for understanding anything about a community, right? Because most of you, and this is unavoidable, it's not a criticism, are collecting genealogies in a very targeted way, in a relatively short time, often without much local knowledge, right, of the social system or the marriage arrangements, which are changing, of course, or the kin terminology, or even the social field. And by that I mean, who are the big players in this community? Who are the sort of opinion makers or the brokers between, who are the senior ritual leaders? Who are the important matriarchs? That sort of thing. You may not know any of this, right? And just going in and collecting, looking for apicals or collecting descendants of apicals doesn't provide you with any kind of information about this. And so it's good if you go to a community to have a little bit of this information. You may not use it, but it may help you fill things out. And one of the big weaknesses, and this is in all these genealogies, and which you do need to think about, is the issue of spouses, right? What people tend to do when they're focusing on descent groups, they get a man and they say, oh, and was he married? Yes, married to so-and-so. What children do they have? And they find nothing out about the wife other than her name. They may possibly find out her descent group, or exactly the same with a woman and her husband. They may just get his name, possibly his descent group. But you definitely need to know a little bit more about the spouses, particularly the husband and wife of the spouses, particularly the husbands and wives of the women. Not the husband and wife, the father and mother of the women. So here's a descent group, the black dot descent group here. So it's a man, he's got 2 children, and he's got several grandchildren down here. Now, if you just go along and collect that genealogy and you get the children and you get this person's, this man's wife, or he's got 2 wives and this thing, and you don't collect any information up here, then you're going to be very poorly informed about the politics and the interconnections between families. Because if you don't collect their parents, you don't know who is responsible for the marriage of this person to this man, right? And this is where you really need to know about these things. In most of these systems, the person who's important in the marriage of this woman to this man in the old days wasn't the father, it's the mother-in-law and her family. And you wouldn't get you wouldn't even know what the mother-in-law's descent group was if you didn't collect at least the name and clan of the girl's father and the girl's mother. And the same, it's less important for men, it's more important in wives, to understand that this family here is beholden to this red clan, not really beholden to, this is meant to be a star, this star clan, that the really important people who've got a hold over this man are these people here. And that's why his sister's daughter has married them, because, as we'll see in a minute, in much of Australia, the bestowal system is men give their sisters' daughters to somebody as a husband. And so what's happened, this man has given his sister's daughter to this man, and this man has given his sister's daughter back to him in marriage, right? And so you wouldn't know any of that. You wouldn't know that the good friends and they're in strong alliance with are these red people. If you've just come in and collected a genealogy, which has just got the black people and their spouses, the starred people, but you don't know anything about the marriage relationships. Okay, let me show you why that's also important. Now, this is where what I said at the opening about the changes that have taken between the older generation. If you're talking in Cape York to anybody over 55, 60, it's rather different in understanding their connections arrangements from anybody who's, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Because what affected the kinship systems and marriage arrangements was the average age difference between a husband and wife at marriage. The average over a lifetime was 15 years. The husbands tend to be 15 years older than their wives. But it's 21 years when a girl first got married. And they were girls. They were getting married at between, actually, 10 and 12, 10 and 14 in the past. And the man they were getting married to was of the order of 25 to 30. We can see the impact of this, and this is very helpful for you understanding Aboriginal kinship. This is a sort of a easy way into understanding Aboriginal kinship systems. If you make these assumptions, if you make that classically men married at 30, girls married at 15 and immediately had a child, and that brothers and sisters are of the same age, because a brother could be 2 years older or sister 2 years younger. It doesn't really matter. Now, what's the consequence of this age difference of marriage? It gives a matrilineal bias to kinship and marriage systems. That's why we talk about matrilateral cross-cousin marriage. That's why we talk about mothers, brothers, daughters from a male perspective, or from a female perspective, a mother's, father's, sister's, son's daughter's daughter, from a female perspective. It means that generations through women were going at twice the rate through men. And that's another reason why women know a lot more about kinship. They've got more kin, they're more knowledgeable about more people. And that the generations cycling through males were going at half the speed, 30 years. Let me show you what the consequence of this is. There are four main marriage systems classically in Australia. Carriera system, just named after people in Western Australia, the Arandic system, the Merngen system in Northeast Arnhem Land, and the Pitjantjatjara desert system. And the most common is the Carriera system, which is where people marry their cross cousins, their mother's brother's daughter, or mother's brother's son, or father's sister's daughter and father's sister's son. And in this diagram, everybody is marrying, if we take it from this man's point of view, or let's take it from women. This woman is marrying her father's sister's, wait a second, she's marrying this person here. She's marrying her father's sister's son, right? But the father's sister's son also happens to be her mother's, wait a second, let me sort of start again. She's marrying. I'm so used to doing this from a male perspective that let me do it from a male perspective because I can get this right. This man is marrying his father's sister's daughter. But this woman is also his mother's, and is his mother's brother's daughter, right? Now, the simple way to represent this is the women should be drawn in, but if you leave them out and say they're in the equal sign, this man gives his sister to this man gives his sister to this man, you get sister exchange. So classically, Carriera system is said to be based on sister exchange. That's what the logic of the model is. But this shows you why it doesn't work. What's the likelihood of there being hundreds and hundreds of pairs of brothers and sisters where the man is age 30 and he's got a sister of 15? Very, very unlikely. And of course, sister exchange, real sister exchange, is very rare in the past. This is how it really works. It works as sister's daughter exchange. If you put those ages on that I've given you, you'll see how it works. So men get married at 30, right? And their wife on average is 15. Now, a 15-year-old girl, what have I done here? Wait a second, 30. I'm sorry, this should be 30. Sorry, I must have done this late at night. I'll just get rid of that. A 15-year-old girl will have a mother who's 30 because a woman has a child as soon as she's born under these things. So, and we're saying that a brother and a sister are the same age. So the mother's brother will be 30, and so he will have a sister's daughter who's 15. So he gives his sister's daughter to this man. This man can reciprocate straight away because he's got a sister who's 30, who by that time will have a 15-year-old daughter, and he can give it back to this man. So sister's daughters exchange was the basic way in which marriage systems worked in Australia. I can't do it now. I want to put 30 back in here. I'm sorry I did that. Okay, I'll correct it and put it up. Okay, again, we can see this same problem with why we get matrilateral cross-cousin marriage. Men got married at 30. If we use these average ages, a man of 30 would have a mother 15 years older than him. That's the average age difference between a man and a woman and her first child. The mother's brother would be the same age, but the age difference between a man and his daughters is 30 years. And so he would have a daughter round about 15 because they're not getting married until they're 30. On the other hand, if we trace the links through the father is 15 years older than the average age difference between a man and a wife, 15 years. His sister is the same age, so she was married ages ago, and her children are much older, and they're long, long married. And that's why there is a matrilateral bias to Aboriginal kinship systems. And that's why you hear when people are talking about first marriage choice from a male perspective, talking about a mother's brother's daughter's daughter, Because if you do the exercises I've said to you, which is simply putting these average ages on the diagram, you'll see how the ages work out and how they skew from a male perspective to the matrilateral side, and from a female perspective to the patrilateral side, from a female perspective. So that it very much affects marriage choices. And that if you're going to find who an ego can marry, who's marriageable, tracing links through the father, it's actually the father's sister's daughter's daughter's daughter. If you look at it, so the father's sister's is 45. If she had a child, it would be 15 years younger. Female child would be 30. And if that child had a child, it would be 15. So the other choice, which we don't hear people talking much about because actually she probably doesn't often happen, ego has another choice in these systems where they can marry their mother's mother's brother's daughter's daughter. They can also marry their father's sister's daughter's daughter's daughter, which sounds extraordinary when you say it, but when you put the ages on, you can see how it distorts the marriage arrangements. The very best book on Aboriginal kinship is this book. I don't know if any of you know it. It's very readable. It answers all of the questions. It's got very clear diagrams. I strongly recommend it to you. And if you want another book on kinship and the different kinds of kinship terminologies and systems, this is very old, but it's one of the very best and very clearest. And it would be in any anthropological library.